seeds. So I said, cannot use any fungicide-treated seeds or genetically engineered seeds. So organic farmers have to try to use organic seeds. Now, if the seeds are not commercially available from organic sources, they can use untreated seeds. If they can document that they attempted to find organic seeds and they're not available for the radish variety or whatever, sweet corn or some particular crop that they market, then they're allowed to use conventionally grown but untreated seeds. And here, Albert Lea Seed House is certainly one of the leading suppliers of organic field crop seeds in this area, in this whole region. They've been active in that for many years. I think position themselves very well. But here's just a few catalogs of some vegetable crop, garden seed suppliers that sell organic seeds as well. And there's more and more available all the time. Organic farmers must have a soil building crop rotation, so it can't be corn on corn, it can't be corn on beans. It needs to be, corn, beans, oats, alfalfa. There need to be those small grains or grass family and legumes in the rotation. Here in the upper Midwest, that would be a typical rotation. But even garden crops, you need to work in clover or buckwheat or things to build the soil. And that has its own section in the regulation. The crop rotation practice standard is so important. That's just a fundamental principle and requirement is to have soil building rotations. And then also can use plant and animal materials, so things like compost, manure are commonly used for fertility. But then how that's managed is also regulated, that the fertility management must not contaminate crop, soil, or water with any plant nutrients, pathogens, heavy metals, or prohibited substances. So it's not just what goes on the farmer's field, but how it's managed, that it's not causing a problem when water washes off of those fields. So there's a field of buckwheat, and then here's some hairy vetch, which is just being disked down to feed the soil. Really, that's a wonderful fertilizer, and the soil organisms eat it right up. Compost is allowed. The regulation has specific language I didn't put here, but how many times it has to be turned, what temperatures it has to reach in order to be truly compost. But if it's not compost, then it's still called raw manure, if it's animal manure. And then there's very strict requirements that it has to be incorporated into the soil, not just surface spread, but actually worked in at least 120 days prior to the harvest of a crop for human consumption, if that crop can contact the soil, or 90 days if it doesn't. So if somebody's growing, leafy greens, spinach, lettuce, things like that, and they want to use raw manure, it has to be at least 120 days between the incorporation of that manure and harvest of the crop. And there's nothing comparable that conventional farmers have to meet as far as a time period between application of manure and harvest. But if it's like sweet corn, well, it's up off the ground, it's in a husk, so that could be 90 days because it's not going to contact the soil. So naturally mined materials, things like limestone, gypsum, rock phosphate, those kind of things are allowed. Naturally mined substances are allowed for organic by definition unless they're specifically prohibited. So, but if they're natural materials, they're allowed. So the producer has to implement management practices as a first order to prevent pest, weed, and disease problems. It's not just switching from the chemical insecticide to some approved organic insecticide. No, you need to address some of the management issues, cultural practices, and I'll give some examples of that. For weed management, Things like the crop rotation certainly helps break weed cycles. Good sanitation, removing weed seeds from the field. You can mulch with straw, leaves, things like that, biodegradable materials. Mowing, grazing livestock, hand weeding, mechanical cultivation, very common. Flame weeding is also quite common in this area for row crop production, where farmers have a cultivator set up that shoots out flame that kills the weeds but not the crop because they're going so fast, and the weeds have a much thinner stem and can't take the heat, whereas the corn can. So that is kind of a rescue treatment, but that is allowed. And then plastic mulch, like in the lower picture there, are allowed so long as the plastic is removed from the field at the end of the harvest or growing season. So you need to be prepared to get the plastic off the ground. For pest and disease management, also that crop rotation, it's a cornerstone. But good sanitation, selecting varieties that are resistant to pests or diseases is key. Mechanical and physical means, and then releasing predators or parasites is quite common for organic vegetable or fruit production, high-value crops. But also, putting in hedgerows or plantings that provide habitat for those predators and parasites too. And then you can use lures, traps, and repellents. And then, if any of those things are not sufficient, then you can use a natural, biological, botanical, or mineral input. Something that's a natural input you can use, but only after you've done whatever mechanical or cultural practices fit your operation. So you can't just jump to a different input without doing those preventative type practices. The organic farmers cannot use arsenate-treated lumber for any new installation or replacement purposes if it's going to contact the crop, soil, or livestock. And that, science has certainly shown that the arsenic does leach into the soil and can be taken up by crops or consumed by livestock. Records, well, records aren't just a good idea. Once you choose to get certified, they're actually required. And so this is one of the hardest things. It's an inspector friend of mine always said, well, what you do out on the land is what makes you organic. What you do in the office is what makes you certified. I mean, it is one of the more challenging things, is keeping a record. But you have flexibility. They can be adapted to your operation. A market gardener is not going to keep the same records as a dairy farmer. So whatever's appropriate. But you do have to keep them for at least 5 years. Those records have to demonstrate that the operation is in compliance, and they have to be made accessible. When the inspector asks for them, you have to provide them. You can't say, no, I'm sorry, the dog ate them or whatever. No, you do have to keep records, and you have to make them accessible. And I should have mentioned also that many organic farms are what's called split operations. They're part organic and part conventional, or part still in transition and parts fully certified. So not 100% certified, all the acres. And that's fine under our regulation. You can do that forever, maintain a split operation. But a couple of things. You have to keep more records because you have to be able to document that none of the conventional was sold as organic. You have to open up your records on the conventional side of the farm for inspection too. It's not that they're always going to be scrutinized, but you have to be prepared to make those accessible to the inspector. But if you do have a split operation and say you're raising, grains and you store them, well, you had to document that the combine was cleaned out, that the elevator, the bins, everything. You really have a separate system to segregate the organic from the conventional. So it is a bit of a hassle, but People do it. It's a good way to get in. They aren't having to change to a whole new form of agriculture in 1 year. It's like, okay, we're going to take that 40-acre field and switch it over, and then see how it goes, and then learn from that and bring more in over time. And that's been quite a common story. So those records, and this is the dairy farmers' records. They get a lot of records they keep, healthcare and all that. But they must disclose all activities and transactions in sufficient detail as to be readily understood and audited. And that's language right out of the regulation there. What does that mean? Well, it means all activities, so you have to keep records of your farming activities. And transactions, that's basically everything you bought, everything you sold. You have to have records of those things. And they have to be detailed enough so that the inspector can understand them. And then when it says audited, that's not a financial audit by a CPA type thing. It just is, it's a balance audit. So when the inspector comes and you were growing organic on these certain fields, you can reconstruct the activities to show where the seed came from, what your fertility system was, how you controlled weeds, etc., what you sold, where it was stored, so you can reconstruct your activities. That's the kind of audit we're talking about, not a full-blown financial audit by any means.